Good morning. So I'm going to be talking about inverting marine terraces to paleo sea level. This is the work I've been doing over the past year between Grenoble and Lyon. So to start off with paleo sea level, this is an important object to study, mostly in terms of paleoclimate, ice sheets and geodynamics, among several other topics. But the problem with reconstructing paleo sea level is currently there are very large uncertainties if you look at quaternary sea level curves. So here you can see a compilation of 14 different curves, 14 different reconstructions. You can see uncertainties, so these are just the peaks of the most recent 400,000 years, span several tens of meters at this point. Why is that? Well, all of these curves are typically based on oxygen isotope ratios. And depending on how you invert those to sea level and which methodologies you use, there's quite a scatter in outcomes that are complicated to explain at this point. So the alternative is to look directly at coastlines for geologic evidence of relative sea level indicators. And that's what I've been doing over the past years, and then specifically focusing on marine terraces. So marine terraces are flat, gently sloping surfaces of marine origin bounded by fossil sea cliffs, both land and seawards. Here you can see an example from the Gulf of Corinth in Greece with those flat areas. So this is a simple model, a cliff erosion model that gives a bit of an indication of how you would form such a sequence of these flat surfaces. So this is a very simple sea level curve that is varying, and you can see how it sort of affects the way these sort of staircases are being formed. Now, this is a forward model, and yeah, basically over the past years, there's been quite some studies using this sort of procedure to vary input parameters and existing sea level curves to compare models and observations, yeah, to say something about both tectonics or about sea levels. So a logical next step, instead of doing this forward modeling, we thought would be inversion modeling. So really developing a way to find the complete range of parameters, including sea level, that could reproduce an observed morphology to find out how unique those solutions are. So we use this cliff erosion model that I showed you in the previous slide. Not so many parameters involved, basically an uplift rate, an initial slope of the land that you start to erode. And this erosion rate sort of develops as you carve out these terraces. But yeah, there is also sort of a roughly known range of parameters for that. A wave-based depth, like how deep is this erosion taking place, and then a sea level curve or sea level history. There's also inversion parameters involved, but I won't go into details on that today. So to vary sea level curves, in blue you can see a published sea level curve, and then we made a simple approximation of this using a cubic spline interpolation, yeah, to sort of like make things relatively simple and smooth. And then we were varying these nodes within specific boxes. We started off with relatively small boxes to play around with possible values, and then we made them bigger to check a wider range of possibilities. So we started with synthetic test. So basically using known parameters to create a so-called observed topography, and then to check with this inversion procedure how well we could find back those input parameters. So here you can see an example with only one terrace. Let's say you can see that this input curve in light green is very similar to what we find, or the input sea level curve in black is very similar to this best fitting inversion result. So that's encouraging in that sense. So what is interesting here is that if you look at the Holocene, so this period of sea level rise, because this terrace that is being created is mostly below sea level, the range of possible sea level histories that could have recreated that is very, very broad. And for this other terrace from MIS3 that is being formed here, this is much narrower, the range of possibilities, which also makes sense because, well, there's a very specific geometry to this terrace. What's interesting is that you have a certain non-uniqueness, though, that younger and higher sea level peaks would create a very similar sort of terrace to older and lower sea level peaks, where this slope is sort of proportional to the uplift rate. In this example, is 2 millimeters per year. So then we moved to using more nodes and more boxes to play around with. So this is over the past 150,000 years, these models. And then if you take different uplift rates, of course, you have different terrace sequences, and then the inversion also changes a bit for possible sea level histories. Now, these are just taken individually, these curves, but if you assume there's one common sea level history that would have constructed both of these terrace profiles at the same time with different uplift rates, all of a sudden you get much better constraint on possible sea level history. So that sort of teaches the lesson that the more profiles you try to invert at the same time, the more unique your solution is going to be in terms of past sea level. So we started applying this to real terraces. So this is an example from Santa Cruz, which is a famous marine terrace sequence. It has 5 terraces that all have been dated, even though they're under discussion. So I simply traced this published profile and to see in this inversion procedure how we could recreate that. As you can see, there's a good fit with realistic results in this sense. What is interesting is that high stands tend to be better constrained than low stands, which sort of makes sense intuitively. But also, like I mentioned in the synthetic profile before, there's also a certain non-uniqueness to solutions for these high stands, where younger and higher sea level peaks seem to create similar terraces as older and lower sea level peaks. So that's an interesting element to consider. So then we move to the Gulf of Corinth, where there's also well-known marine terrace sequences. This one is poorly dated though, but with the advantage that there is several uplift rates along these coastlines. So yeah, there's this possibility to make this joint inversion of multiple profiles. So first starting off with a few boxes, so just one box per peak, MIS3, 5A, 5C, and 5E. It's not terrible, but it's not a perfect fit with this terrace sequence. So we figured, okay, probably we need more high stands or a bit more variation within these high stands to make sure we can really recreate this terrace sequence appropriately. So this is what we did, and you can see there's a much better fit in the way these terraces can be reconstructed. What is nice with this approach in general, there's no manual assessment of terraces, so it's quite objective in the way we are treating this topography. And also what is nice that even without having much age constraints other from the MIS5E terrace, we can still get quite well constrained results, especially in this younger part, which possibilities could have recreated this, this marine terrace sequence. So again, like with the previous example, if we take 2 profiles individually along this coastline, yeah, some parts are better resolved than others. But if we invert them both at the same time, it tends to get quite unique amount of sea level histories that could have recreated both of these profiles. So yeah, this gives also much better results in that sense. Another example, advantage of using our approach is that we are not only solving sea level, but also other parameters. So it's interesting to see, this is from the Santa Cruz example, there's this trade-off between erosion rate and wave-based depth, that higher erosion rates and higher wave-based depths give similar terraces as lower erosion rates and lower wave-based depth. You can see a similar trade-off as well between erosion rate and initial slope. Uplift rates, this is not so much the case, but anyway, it's also good to see the complete range of uplift rates that would roughly fit with the observations. Another thing, of course, these are just 2 examples, but what is interesting is that both of these examples give quite high MIS3 values that are close to sort of the maximum feasible possibilities. And there's two explanations for that, I would say. One of them, there has been growing evidence that indeed MIS3 has been much higher than previously thought from oxygen isotope work. So maybe MIS3 was indeed relatively high. The other possibility, because it's just two areas, that there's been variable uplift rates involved, which I kept constant throughout this 150,000 years, but of course that might have varied a bit as well, biasing our results. So in conclusion, what we could see from both the synthetic tests and the real examples, that high stands are a bit easier to solve than low stands, but also with these high stands there's a bit of non-uniqueness. Another thing is that multiple terraces, looking at multiple terraces at the same time, give much better constraints in terms of inversion and reduces the bias. So that is promising as well. And it's also applicable to marine terraces that are poorly dated. You can still resolve quite a bit of information on past sea level, even without a lot of ages. So in the future, what we'll try to do is apply this model and this inversion to several wave-cut marine terraces around the world to get a bit of a global perspective in that sense, like what these terrace sequences bring in terms of sea level. And also what we're trying to do is apply this model, but then to coral reef terraces, which involves a bit more parameters. But there's also much more data available on that. So in that respect, that would also be a promising thing to do. I thank you very much for your attention.